It's been 5 years since you've been on this Red Circle.
5 long years.
How has time, not only personally, but for you in your job, looking at masculinity in the world, with boys, with young people, how have things changed?
Do you know what? Massively. I think one of the biggest things that we've noticed, right, is post-pandemic, kids are like super far behind in their social skills. I think they missed like 2 core years of development. So that's been a big thing. And then I think another massive thing has been like this movement, this migration of communication online. And it feels like, I don't know if this is my age speaking now, but it feels like everything is online right now and everything's new. Like there are new apps popping up that I have no idea what they are. I don't know what's going on.
Be Real.
Be Real? I don't know what this is. But yeah, loads and loads of stuff. And I think one of the biggest things that we're facing as an organization is we've been inundated with requests recently to talk about the rise in online misogyny influencer culture. And so some really harmful stuff that's going on there, right? And I think it's important that we make it clear that, like, for the kids who are accessing this stuff, that's not necessarily their fault. I think part of it is that the algorithm is going to show it what it wants to show them anyway. But I think kids are really receiving this new form of messaging that's been packaged in a very specific way. And schools are contacting us with like real concerns about the behaviors of their boys, their attitudes, the attitudes that boys are displaying towards their peers, towards girls, towards female members of staff. And we've also had a couple of requests from parents to help to talk about these issues that they're experiencing in their relationships now with their sons. So I think this has been like a big change that's been going on for maybe about a year or so now. And it's a weird one, right? Because when I was like 13, my influencers were like, I don't know, like Newsround hosts and Blue Peter presenters. But now, kids are being influenced by people that are being accused of sex trafficking and rape and all kinds of stuff. So I'm sure you would have heard of like people like Andrew Tate, who's like probably spearheading this movement at the moment, but loads and loads of people online who are spreading this messaging and this propaganda, which can be really, really harmful to young people.
And I think what the scariest point about this is that before it used to feel like quite a small conversation. It's now mammoth, and parents are coming back with conversations. Teachers are coming back with conversations, like you say, to you, saying, Ben, what do we do? You know, how does it look? What reaction are you finding from teachers and parents when it comes to them understanding what their young people are actually looking at?
It's the most natural reaction. I'm sure it's the thing that comes naturally to all of us, right? Which is like to police the behavior. And a pretty aggressive policing of the behavior. I think there's either one of 2 directions that people move in, which is the first one is to like sweep it under the carpet, ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist, hopefully it will go away. And the second one is to come down like a ton of bricks on anything that anybody says that you think is harmful or problematic, which I can understand, but it doesn't actually work, right? And I think there's something about, particularly with teens, the nature of their development at that age where they're trying to like create these personalities, they're trying to differentiate from their parents, from their caregivers, they want to be contrarian, they want to think things that they're not allowed to think, they want to explore things that have been hidden from them. Right. And so I'm not sure that this response that feels very natural is having the kind of effect that we want it to have. And you know, I spoke a couple of years ago, and I spoke about this idea of the collective socialization of men and all of these ideals that we have as a society and as a culture around what men are supposed to be and how they're supposed to behave. So ideas like being dominant, being a leader, being in charge, being able to get with lots of women, so on and so forth. And this feels like a really like carefully branded version of that, which is also very, very extreme and rooted at its core in misogyny. And so I guess the conversation then becomes quite a complicated one, because how do you have a conversation with some kids that makes them reconsider what they're supposed to be doing?
Exactly, and you know, and if you're like myself, you don't have kids, or you're not at school,
Right.
or I know it might look like I could be in school, but
You don't. You're good. You're good. Oh, you do. You do.
Thank you. But what's most concerning is that, you know, as you mentioned many years ago, this conversation felt like it was kind of on the ether. You know, it was on the fringes.
Right.
It was happening in a way that you could kind of not tokenize it by saying it's just those few people on the side, but now it's everywhere. You know, it's inseparable, it's on the internet, it's in our society. And I don't really feel like that's being spoken about, because people just presume, no, they're over there, they're on the internet. People use the internet. Human beings
true.
are the people behind that. And there's a perceived safety in that idea, isn't it? That it's hidden.
Yeah, do you know what? One of my personal faves, Laura Bates, speaks about this in her book, Men Who Hate Women, and some really interesting ideas in like this perceived safety that we have around these ideas being fringe ideas that are like on the outskirts of our society. And whilst that's still concerning, I think it gives us a little bit of rest, because we're like, it's not really having that much influence. But I think at this moment that we're in now, we're seeing that this has become mainstream. It's become very, very normal, very dominant narratives that people are accessing. And it's everywhere. Like, honestly, we don't go into a school without it coming up anymore. I think every single school that we've been in, maybe for the last year now, there's been a conversation, at least one conversation, if not more, about this kind of stuff, right? Andrew Tate or whoever it might be. And it is being specifically targeted at young people, which obviously makes sense. Like, when you think about what the messaging is, it's obviously much harder to convince a 35-year-old man that he's less of a man because he doesn't own a Bugatti than it is a 16-year-old boy.
Sure.
So that messaging obviously works for certain demographics better than it works for others. But I think we're at this precipice where we're seeing these ideas starting to become action. And that's what's scary about it, right? In my previous talk, the tagline was, boys won't be boys, boys will be what we teach them to be. And this idea that the reason that this is an issue is because boys grow into men. But in Greece the other day, maybe weeks ago, right, we saw protests, hundreds of boys taken to the streets to support these ideas and to chant for the freedom of their leader. And so this is no longer something that is just hidden away on the internet. It's no longer in the back corners of Reddit forums. This is a conversation that's urgent, and a conversation that we've all got to start having.
Absolutely. You know, exactly like you say, these conversations may happen on the internet, but they turn into action. And I personally noticed, you know, if you take my TEDx London talk and you look at the commentary on that, a lot of it was kind of just quite explicitly transphobic, which is obviously awful, but it didn't have the kind of visceral take that a lot of the online commentary that I get now is very political, it's very conservative, it's very right-wing, it's very violent, it's very specific, and it's very kind of pointed at me, like we're saying, where I should belong, what I should be doing, why I'm this and that. You know, it's very potent. And I think Greece, for example, that is a great example of how these conversations turn into action. We've covered what's going on. We've covered how it's really important that we engage. What do we need to do now? How does that look like? Broad question, hate me all you like, but what do we do?
You need to hire beyond equality. No, I'm joking. I think that we know, right, for sure that policing the behavior doesn't work. We know that the core of any transformational work has always been deep reflection, has always been in like conversation. So I think we've got to find a way to move towards that. Keith McGee, in his TEDx London talk recently, spoke about this idea of listening for connection rather than listening for conversion, which is something that I think really resonates with me, especially when we're working with young people, because the idea here is not that we are listening to them to try and get them, to trick them into changing their minds. But I think that actually, as facilitators, as adults, as leaders, there's a lot of value for us in understanding why these ideas are resonating so much with them, understanding where they're coming from. We, as an organisation, have supported Bold Voices, another organisation, to develop some toolkits which are really, really good for teachers and for parents on how to tackle these conversations with kids about these online misogynist influences. And I think the core of it is like things that we say all the time, right? Being compassionate, being inquisitive, asking questions, following thoughts to their logical logical conclusion. And acknowledging that young people are going to be young people, right? They're going to make mistakes, and that's part of being young. But actually, one of the great things about young people is that they change their minds all the time, right? So I think if we can have some good conversations with them where they're really allowed to explore, then hopefully they can move towards better conclusions for themselves.
Absolutely. You know, I liked Edward, and then I liked Jacob. And then I went back to Edward.
Relatable, clearly, yeah.
Do you see, now, if we follow that advice, do you see a way forward?
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad.
Sorry, I've interrupted your question mid-question, but do I see a way forward?
Period.
Yeah, 100, period. 100%. I think there is always hope, right? And for me, I find a lot of hope in knowing that the amount of influence that's been had over young people in maybe just the last year or 2 years has come from somewhere. It's not an immovable force that we can't change. It just means we've got significant work to do to influence them in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And I think for us as a culture, as a society, that's going to look like mass education, right? And I think also a reinvestment in teacher training is absolutely fundamental to moving this forward. We can't just keep telling people, I know, we can't just keep telling people that they've got to do a better job without equipping them to do a better job. I think it's going to need a concerted effort from all of us to be able to achieve that. And I think the other part of this is providing them with effective alternatives, right? So a lot of this stuff is rooted in these ideas of domination over women, in ideas of success equating to money, and looking like being the man, being dominant, being in control. And actually, I think we've got to create new models of financial education for young people. If that's something that they want, then why is that not something that we're giving them? And new models of mentorship. I'm not big on the idea of role modeling, but I do think there's a case for like some people who are doing some good stuff in the world and not being absolutely disgusting people whilst doing it, to get some more promotion and spotlight.
As a base level.
Yeah, that would be good.
Sure. And I think it's exactly like you say, a lot of these conversations can come out of fear. And I think for me, just reflecting back on that, there's a split between personally engaging in that conversation and seeing that conversation and thinking, that's harmful to me. I have a choice now. I can either completely disregard it, as you mentioned, sweep it under the carpet to look after myself and to say, I don't need that. That's nothing to do with me.
Right.
Or I can say, this is impacting me, but who else is it also impacting? Can I help protect them from what is essentially a more potent threat?
Yeah.
Because although, yes, and as you say in your work, although, yes, we shouldn't have to talk to the oppressors if we are being oppressed in that way, we do hold collective responsibility. You know, putting your fingers in your ears and saying, this isn't happening, isn't going to necessarily help us as a collective and all of us work together, which I think is the common thread between all of our speakers today, is that all of our stories are incredibly different, but the thread that brings us together is that we share the empathy of what it feels like to go through something like this. I don't want to be back here in 5 years' time having the same conversation with you, Ben. I'm sick of the sight of you.
Honestly, I'm doing my best, but this is difficult. And I think, again, right, and this is to speak to what you're saying, this idea of people who are on the margins shouldn't have to do this piece of work. But I think we have to hold that truth in hand with the other truth, which is that we are all impacted by this, and it requires all of our action to change it. So I think we've got some work to do, but we are more equipped now than we've ever been, and I think if we all band together, we can make some real change in this area.
And that's up to you. That's down to you, love.
Yeah, me personally.
Yeah, just you.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
Thank you so much. You're an absolute delight.